Hello, can you hear me? Beautiful. Thank you so much, Colette, for that scripture reading. My name is Jess, if you missed that in there. I've been coming to Springwood Church since about 2016. Reese Cameron is married to me. I have a son, Jasper, and a daughter, Dolly, and I love being a part of this church and a part of this community, and it is a great privilege to be able to share this morning. I'm going to be starting off a new sermon series, God Speaks. I'm a little bit nervous about being the first cab off the rank to be introducing this sermon series, but it's exciting as well. The heart of this theme is to explore the myriad of ways that God speaks. He wants to communicate with us, and his words carry transformative power. We're going to look at the way God speaks in three areas: through Scripture, God speaks through the Holy Spirit, and God has spoken to us ultimately by sending his Son, the Word made flesh. In addition, over the coming weeks, specific examples in Scripture where God directly speaks to an individual will be explored. And today, we're going to be looking at Moses and the burning bush. The reason for looking at this topic, God speaks, is to inspire us now to lean in and listen for God's voice, because he's still speaking. He's still speaking to us today, and he desires to make himself known. So like I said, we're going to be looking at Moses and the burning bush, and there's so much to unpack in this chapter that Colette has just read to us. And no doubt many of us have heard this story many times before if you've grown up in church. I thought I knew this story really well, and I started making lots of notes, and then when I started to dive in and read it, there was just so much. I'm really excited to be able to share because it's amazing. This story is amazing. I want to unpack this story through a framework, and then we'll land at a conclusion which invites us to respond. Because after all, when anyone speaks to us, it's appropriate to respond, right? And I would say that probably applies even more so when it's God who's speaking to us. It's appropriate for us to respond. So we're going to look at what led up to this moment when Moses met God in the burning bush. We're going to look at what happens in the moment, and then we're going to look at what happens afterwards. And then ultimately, when God speaks, how do we respond? So what led up to this moment with the burning bush? Firstly, hundreds of years have passed since Joseph and his brothers settled in Egypt. So we're rewinding a little bit in the story. This is Exodus chapter 3, and at the end of Genesis, we have Joseph and his family settling in Egypt. But then when we get to Exodus, it's about 300 years when we get to the beginning of Exodus. And there is a new Pharaoh, a new dynasty, and this Pharaoh sees the growing Israelite immigrant group as a threat. They're a problem. He either didn't know or he doesn't care about the significance that these people are descendants of Joseph. And so in an attempt to destroy this people group, he brutally enslaves them. But their numbers continue to increase. So much so that Pharaoh decrees that all the Israelite boys will be drowned in the Nile River. The Bible Project then summarizes the next part of Exodus like this: God responds by first turning Pharaoh's plot upside down. An Israelite mother throws her boy into the Nile, protected by a basket, and the child floats right into Pharaoh's very own family. This boy is Moses, and he will eventually become the man God will use to defeat Pharaoh. Moreover, when Moses is brought into the palace of Pharaoh, his own mum is called on to be his wet nurse. A tragedy of a mother forced to give up her child, only for them to be reunited. This is an amazing story already. Moses grows up in the palace of Pharaoh in a privileged position, and one day he goes out and he sees the Egyptian slave masters treating the Hebrew slaves brutally. it's likely he must have known where he had come from. His mum, who was an Israelite woman, was his wet nurse. She must have said something. He must have been told at some point. To have an affinity for the Israelites, so much so that when he sees them being treated brutally, his response then is actually to kill the Egyptian slave driver. And for whatever reason, after he kills the slave master, he flees to the desert. In the desert, he finds a new life. He finds a family and a wife, and he shepherds his father-in-law's flock, which is no doubt a lot of responsibility. And there's about 40 years from when he flees to the desert and we get to this point where he encounters God at the burning bush. So Moses is about 80 years old by the time we get to chapter 3 of Exodus. And it's so hard to grasp this sense of time when Moses is now 80. It's been 40 years since he's fled. We've had almost 300 years of oppression under the Egyptians that the Israelite people are experiencing. There's a lot of time. The passage of time is very long. I mean, I don't really remember what I was doing 40 years ago, so it's hard to grasp this sense of timeline. But what happens in this moment with the burning bush? Moses is in a very dry, rocky desert near Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, and he's just a small figure meandering in sweltering heat with a flock of sheep. As a shepherd, this work is physically demanding, and these temperatures are up to 40 degrees or more, and it's solitary. He's on his own. Moses, perhaps taking a moment to rest, notices a burning bush. One source I read said that it probably wasn't unusual in those sorts of temperatures in the desert for a bush to spontaneously combust. But there is something so unusual about this bush. It doesn't burn up. If I was in a hot desert, a swelteringly hot desert, and I saw that a bush was burning, the last thing that I would do is get closer. I'd get hotter being near a fire, right? I don't want to risk my clothes catching fire. But that doesn't occur to Moses. In the heat of the desert, that doesn't occur to him. It was so curious, so odd a sight that Moses just has to check it out. And as he approaches, God calls to him using his name, Moses, Moses, the repetition giving a sense of urgency. And Moses' response, before he knows who or where this call is coming from, says, "Here I am." Maybe he's looking for the source of the voice. Maybe he's searching. And God says, "Don't come any closer." In other words, stop what you're doing. And then he instructs Moses to take off his sandals. In other words, it is important, Moses, and it is necessary for you to respond in this situation in a way that signals reverence, in a way that signals that you understand the poignancy of what is happening here. This act of taking off your sandals is an act of humility and an act of utmost respect. Moses, you must do this thing to signify that you know who you are speaking with. And then God says who he is. I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses' response now, here I am. Moses' response now, after God says, I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, he doesn't say anything. It's astonishment, it's shock, it's reverence, it's awe, it's fear, and he covers his face. I think perhaps that probably could apply to me sometimes, that I can forget and kind of be a bit like fluffy and airy-fairy and not take a moment to stop and to listen, to be quiet. And God continues to speak. And he says he's heard the cry of the Israelites. He doesn't just know that they're suffering. It says he cares and he wants to do something about it. He's come down to rescue them and he's sending Moses. And God finishes this little explanation with, "So now go." And how does Moses respond now when God has spoken? He says, "Who am I? Who am I?" God is explaining why he's appearing in a burning bush. Such a curious way to meet a bush that's not burning up. So odd. Such a sight. This moment altering the course of Moses' life. And he asks a question that's about himself. He doubts himself. Moses is having a conversation with God via a burning bush, something so impossible. And all he sees is his own crippling self-doubt. Sees his compounding inadequacies. And we know this because he goes on in the next chapter of Exodus, in Exodus 4, to express vehemently, God, I can't do this. These are all the reasons why I can't do this. I sit back and I read this and I think, surely the God who speaks via a burning bush that doesn't burn up is capable of doing much more to overcome the impossible situation that he's just told to Moses. He's just told him, go, this is what I'm doing. Surely he can do more than just appear in a bush. But no, Moses' doubt is his response. He protests. I know I've definitely felt that way, where I can know about God and I can know what he can do, but what takes over in the moment when I'm faced with an impossible situation is my own inadequacy, is my own deficiency, is my own problems, my own shortcomings, my own pain points. That's what I see. It is so human that when God speaks, our response can be doubt. That when God speaks, the situation we face still seems so impossible. That God speaks, and yet what he says is so far removed from our current experience that we can't absorb it. But when Moses asks God, who am I to go? And he's speaking of his own identity. What is God's response there? What is God's response to that? God doesn't answer Moses' question by reminding him of his background. And we looked at that just before. We talked about that just before. God doesn't remind him, hey, Moses, your mum threw you into the Nile River and you floated into Pharaoh's house. Your mum became your wet nurse. And you grew up in this privileged position, a miraculous story. God doesn't remind him of that. God doesn't remind him that living in the palace would have meant that he would have received a royal education and instruction, and that he would have an understanding of both Egyptian language and culture and Israelite language and culture. God doesn't remind him of that there are things that are in his life that set him up to be in a position to face the plans that God has laid out. God doesn't say any of that to Moses. He doesn't remind Moses, you're a shepherd who's endured incredible solitary hardship as a shepherd. You can do this because you've had all these experiences that you no doubt have had to overcome as a shepherd. God doesn't say any of that. God's response when Moses asks, who am I, is to remind Moses of who he is. I think I've got a slide, maybe it's stopped working. God's response is to remind Moses of who he is. He says, I will be with you. This use of I will be, and I'm not a linguist and I'm not very good at Hebrew. That's not something that I'm very good at all. But what this is, I will be, is the use of an imperfect verb. And it's the word that we now translate as Yahweh. And there is incredible detail in this simple line, I will be with you. This is the first time that Ehyeh, or Yahweh as we now translate it, is first used in the Bible. And I don't have time to go into how incredible that is, but just a side note, if you're interested, look up the Bible Project's explanation of the word Lord. All capitals, L-O-R-D, Lord. That aside, I know enough to say that I will be, as the imperfect verb, means that it's something that is an ongoing action that existed in the past and continues even now into the future. So when God says, I will be with you, it is continuous. It's without end. This is also the same verb tense, the same word that's used in verse 14 later on when he says, I am who I am. I exist, I am everlasting, I am here. God has been, is, and always will be. When Moses is overcome by self-doubt, by the impossibility of the situation ahead, God's response is to remind Moses of who he is. He gives Moses a revelation of who he is. He is the God who hears the cries of his people, but he is also the God who is here. What I think is being emphasized here is that Moses' perspective of the situation, when God downloads all of this information to him, Moses' perspective of the situation ought to have much less to do with his ability or confidence or his perceived inadequacies and everything to do with God. And the same is for us. Our perspective of any given situation ought to have much less to do with our ability, our confidence, our inadequacies, and everything to do with God. In other words, when I feel inadequate, when I feel like a situation is impossible, when I feel like I'm not enough, when I doubt myself, when I can't see a way forward, the most important thing for me to remember, and the thing that God reminds Moses of before anything else, is that he is here. I will be with you. God is here with you. When God speaks, who he is becomes clearer. This is the first point that the word Yahweh is used to refer to God. And it's continuously used from this point onwards. When God speaks, who he is becomes clearer. Let's just zoom out for a moment and cast our thoughts back to the Israelites. They've spent hundreds of years oppressed under Egyptian slavery, crying out in their distress. What do you think their impression or picture of God would have been through that time? Maybe they had this picture of God that he was distant, that he was uncaring, that he didn't care about their cries of distress, that he was unbothered by their plight. But then God tells Moses, I've heard them. I'm here. I've come down. He speaks to clear up this misconception that I will be with you. When God speaks, who he is becomes clearer. He's the God who listens, who cares, who rescues, who provides, who is with us and will be with us. It's worth noting here that God speaks about who he is before he explains the details of what he is going to do or how he's going to do it. God speaks about who he is to Moses before he lets Moses in on way more of the details of the plan. Like all of the details of the plan, actually. And Moses' response is to continue pleading with God that he's deficient, that he's incapable of fulfilling the task. And God lets Moses in on more of the details and reassures him by giving him signs, the miracle of the staff turning into the snake, and the miracle of his hand being diseased and then being healed. So that's what happens in this moment. We've looked at what led up to it, what happens in this moment, and now what happens afterwards. Well, let's fast forward a bit further because, spoiler alert, I imagine everyone would know this. Moses does lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Hooray. All the things that God said would happen did happen. Hooray, obviously. That sounds sarcastic, but it is amazing. God's laid out these plans and they've happened. So let's fast forward. Moses and the Israelites are back in the desert, back where Moses received this summons from God, the very same place, just as God said that they would be there. And Exodus 3 verse 12 gives us a clue as to what happens afterwards. This will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, which Moses does, you will worship God on this mountain. And the you will worship God on this mountain is actually a plural. It's talking about the Israelites. And so they've returned to this place, and the Israelites are near Mount Sinai, and Moses goes up onto the mountain to receive the blueprints for the tabernacle. And what do the Israelites do in that time? What is their response? Well, it talks about this in Exodus chapter 32. It says, when the people saw how long it was taking Moses to come back down the mountain, they gathered around Aaron, who was Moses' brother, who ended up being Moses' side guy, second-hand man to help lead the Israelites out of Egypt. They go up to Aaron and they say, come on, they said, make us some gods who can lead us. We don't know what happened to this fellow Moses who brought us here from the land of Egypt. So in their impatience, the Israelites ask Aaron to make a god to worship as the one who rescued them from Egypt. So Aaron asked them to collect their gold earrings, the gold jewelry, and bring it to him. And he creates a golden calf. Where in the desert did they get enough gold to not only wear it, but tear it from their ears, is what it says, and give it to Aaron to make an idol from? Especially considering that some sources track that when they're back in the desert, back at Mount Sinai, this event is about 6 or 7 months after they have escaped from Egypt. Does anyone know? I didn't know this. I have to confess, I actually didn't know this at all. When God was giving the plans to Moses, as we read in chapter 3 of Exodus, at the end of it, in 19 to 22 of chapter 3, God basically says that the Egyptians are going to look so favorably upon you guys when you leave, you can just ask them to give you gold. Ask them for their gold and they're just going to give it to you. They're going to willingly hand it over. You're going to pillage them, but you don't have to do anything, just ask. And they're going to look so favorably upon you that they'll just hand it over, which is amazing. That's mind-boggling. The gold used to create this calf was that gold. The gold that God said would be provided to them upon leaving Egypt. He promised them a blessing in Exodus 3 to Moses. Promised that they wouldn't go empty-handed. He brings them out of oppression, out of slavery, out of this difficult dark place with a blessing, and then they fast forward and they're back at the place where God said that they will worship him, and they get impatient. Aaron, make us a god. And they take the blessing and they turn it into a golden calf. They turn the blessing into the thing that they worship. And there's a whole saga that comes out of that. But that's for another time. My point is this. When God speaks, we get a clearer picture of who he is. And the sign, the fitting response to that is worship. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. They had a choice. They had a choice of where to put their worship. And we have a choice. We have a choice. When God speaks, and who he is becomes clearer, who or what will we worship? Like Moses, what situation are you facing right now? What are you feeling? Are you feeling overwhelmed? Are you burdened by the weight of your own inadequacy? Are you burdened by doubt or grief? Is there a situation at home or at work that seems impossible? Are you anxious? Are you tired? Maybe you're numb. Maybe there's just nothing. We have a choice. Will we stay there, burdened under the weight of inadequacies, eyes on the impossible situation? Or will you, like Moses removing his sandals, take this moment to be reverent, to be still and know he is God, to listen as God speaks and he reminds you, I will be with you. Or maybe you've been led out of a place of hardship, like the Israelites, and you have blessings upon blessings and things have killed out and they're pretty cruisy. Maybe there's not much going on. Like the Israelites, when not much was happening, they easily forgot what they were waiting on. What does it mean for us to be in this place of not much happening? What are we going to do in that place? Are you going to look at the blessing and forget the provider? Like the Israelites looked at their blessing, turned that into an idol and forgot that it was God who provided that for them, that is God that they're waiting on? When God speaks, who he is becomes clearer. And we have a chance to respond. To remember that whatever situation we face, it has so much less to do with us and everything to do with God, whose power is made perfect in weakness. We have a chance to remember that he provides all we need to fulfill the plans that are laid out before us. To remember that he is the one who hears, who cares, who comes down, who rescues. to remember ultimately God coming down to us to rescue us was as Jesus. The great I am became human, became one of us. And through the life of Jesus, God spoke to remove any doubt about who he is. He is Yahweh, the one who was, the one who is, and the one who will be with us. And we have a chance to respond. And when we understand who he is, the appropriate response is worship. Let's worship.